recording.
Welcome to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. This show I've been looking forward to for so long, basically because I'm researching material for my forthcoming book, which is provisionally entitled Opening the Doors of Perception. And this book will be dealing with what I'm provisionally calling at the moment the Bergsonian continuum, the Bergsonian complex, whatever we're meant to call it. And it's to do with the work of Henri Bergson and the idea that the human brain acts as an attenuator. By this, Bergson meant that effectively the human brain exists to actually take out a lot of the information and material that under normal circumstances the human mind could bring in. This was taken further by the work of Aldous Huxley, who in 1954 published a book called The Doors of Perception. And in this book, Aldous Huxley described some of the experiences he had with mescaline and very many other mild mind-altering substances. And he came to exactly the same opinion, and I think he used the term a reducing engine for the idea that the human mind, under normal circumstances, cuts things out. Now, in the latest book, I will be arguing that there are certain individuals around the world who, for different neurological reasons, probably the way in which the neurochemicals within their brain work, are effectively in a position where they can attune into something that we neurotypicals cannot do so. This kind of idea of an information field. My latest book with Irvin Laszlo, myself and Irvin Laszlo expand upon this and the idea that could it be zero-point energy? Could it be to do with the processing of microtubules via the Hamerhoff and Penrose OR ideas and everything else? Now, as I was researching the subject, I was doing a web search and I came across the work of Diane Hennacy Powell. And believe me, I've been now researching for around about 20 years and been a writer for 10 of those. And what she is doing literally stopped me in my tracks. It was for the first time that there is a scientist who is actually going out there and doing the empirical evidence, the research, to actually prove the things that many of us believe to be true, but effectively find quite difficult to prove scientifically because of the question of repeatability, the question of the scientific method and what the scientific method demands. Now, Diane Hennacy Powell is a scientist through and through and has been a scientist since she was a child. But what I'd like to do is introduce Diane to us now. And what I'd like Diane to do is just give us a little bit about her background, just to prove that she's not some new age wacko that people will be talking about. This is a serious scientist who has serious ideas and has amazing pedigree. And I think this is why the Randys of this world, the Michael Shermans of this world are terrified of this woman, because she is really doing the business. So Diane, welcome to Consciousness Hour.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, well, maybe
first of all, you want me to say what my training was? Or?
If you can, yeah, for a few minutes, just let us get to know you a little bit and your background.
Okay, well, first of all, when I was an undergraduate, I was, it wasn't a neuroscience major at the university I was at, but I was basically doing research in physiological psychology, and I was also doing neuroscience work in laboratories as well as taking coursework. And I was going to go to graduate school in neuroscience or biophysics. Those were the two areas I was doing research in. And what happened was I decided actually to go to medical school because I was interested in human consciousness. To me, that was the most interesting thing. And at the time, neurosurgeons were the ones that were doing the most exciting research. They were recording from the cortex of patients while they're awake, having surgery, and they were finding all kinds of fascinating, things from that. And so I thought that's what I wanted to do. And so I went to Johns Hopkins Medical School, and with the intention of becoming a neurosurgeon. And while I was there, I got to know several of the psychiatrists there, and Joseph Coyle was there, and so was Solomon Snyder. And Solomon Snyder is the scientist who was working on the neuropeptides, finding the initial, opiates of the brain, that sort of thing. Candace Burke worked in his laboratory. And so that was what was going on at the time. I was very excited about that research. And so I ended up working in neuroscience laboratories while being in medical school at Johns Hopkins and staying on and actually becoming a neuropsychiatrist and then going on to Harvard where I was on faculty and then After Harvard, I was out in California, and I became a member of a think tank that met at the Salk Institute, and there were several Nobel laureates who were part of the group. And we were talking about the evolution of human consciousness. And several of the people in that group are names people would recognize, like V.S. Ramachandran, who's a famous neurologist. And so, anyway, so that's my pedigree, and I went off on my own because of a combination of becoming a mother, but also finding that that the answers were just not possible within the model that they were working with then. And I just knew that we had to start looking at other phenomena. And, I had also I left out that I also studied genetics and had papers published in genetics, neuropsychiatric disorders, and actually worked in molecular biology during the Human Genome Project. So I was looking in genetics because I wasn't finding the answers in neuroscience. And so with that as my background, I started looking into anomalies and became really interested in autistic savants, and that's where my research is today.
That's intriguing, just as an aside, really. I've been a great fan of Ramachandran for many, many years, and Oliver Sacks. And when I've read Ramachandran's books and Oliver Sacks's books, I always find them quite fascinating because they very much touch in the border areas of psychology, the man who mistook his wife for a hat, and Ramachandran's work, particularly with temporal lobe epileptics and Waxman-Gershwin syndrome and such like, and the way in which temporal lobe epileptics seem to have this kind of mystic worldview. When you worked with those guys, did you feel that they were analyzing the results and the things that their clients or their subjects were telling them? Were they actually registering the way that you and I would register them, or were they thinking them differently? It's just an opportunity to actually just discover what it is that makes them think one way and you think a different way.
Well, it's it's interesting because particularly since V.S. Ramachandran comes from India, and in India, has, we were discussing pre-program, India, people believe in all of these, special abilities, and people go there and they actually witness these things and they come back and they talk about what a magical country it is. And, the question is, what's going on there, and the power of belief and how once people start to believe in something, it has to be not just knowing that it exists. It has to be that you actually really believe that it's possible. And once you think it's really possible, then you actually can, you're open up to the possibility of having the experience. And I find that a lot of people, after they read my first book, the ESP Enigma, they found that, just the evidence that I accumulated there, from other people's research, but, collected it, looking for neurological correlates with psychic abilities. I was, in that, after reading that, people actually started having experiences of psychic things that, they never had before, because it was like it gave them permission. And so I think that some people, they get so swept up into the mindset of secular science that it's like that's their major blind spot. And so one of the reasons why I left was that I saw what the model was, and I understood that, yes, if you really exclude, all of these other things that people have experienced and witnessed and would swear on their mother are true, if you're going to ignore all of those things, then, yeah, that model works. But what about those things? It doesn't explain those. And so that's why I had to go and explore those things and see if they really were true.
You mentioned
it's an essential question to be asking ourselves.
You mentioned actually the neurological correlates that you actually discovered in your first book in terms of that. Can you tell us a little bit of that? Because I'm quite intrigued as to, as a neuroscientist, where do you think, what is actually happening when we talk about ESP in regards to the brain structures and the neurochemicals in the brain and everything else?
Well, there's been quite an evolution of my thinking about this, as you can imagine, and over the years, because there really isn't anybody else that's really putting much attention into that. And so what I did was I first looked at, sorry, I have a dog here who needs a ball thrown for him.
Feel free.
That's the human side of me. I'm not just a scientist. Anyway, he's just staring at me with those eyes. So anyway, so what I found in the way of neurological correlates was that, first of all, if you look at who experiences these things to the highest degree, it's people who are autistic savants. In fact, Bernie Rimland, he studied over 5,400 autistic children back when autism was not that common of a diagnosis as it is today, and he actually thought that ESP was a savant skill, and reported it in children. And a lot of the savant skills are so similar to what we call ESP that, and they're just as mysterious. People don't have an explanation for them. So, I thought, okay, well, what if they're really, similar mechanisms? And then I looked at, and bipolar disorder is another one in which people have these incredible experiences, and also attention deficit disorder. So I looked at, those clusters, and what I kept, and then famous psychics like Inga Swan, because a lot of the psychics will not undergo the neuroimaging studies. They don't want to subject themselves to those, those powerful magnetic fields. And but Inga Swan did subject himself to a lot of work. And what I found is that if you're looking at their brain waves, frequently what you see is that they have periods in which they're in a mixed state. It's not purely an awake state. There's like some REM sleep components that are mixed into it, which I find very interesting, because the other thing is that all of us dream at night, and people who aren't otherwise psychic will oftentimes have some precognitive or telepathic experience in a dream. And so that state itself was of interest to me. And what I found when I looked at, more deeply at that, is that if you look at the physiology of dreaming, most of our cortex actually gets quieter. There's less activity in our cortex, and most of the activity is really happening in the deeper structures of the brain, and then some of the sensory cortex, particularly the visual cortex, and the angular gyrus. And the angular gyrus is really the area that I became the most interested in when I was looking, because I was okay, so it's got to be one of these brain areas, and then the angular gyrus is that is really prime real estate. And the reason why the angular gyrus is really prime real estate is that if you stimulate the angular gyrus, you can simulate an out-of-body experience. And out-of-body experiences are very similar to flying dreams, and they're also the way that a lot of psychic people experience their psychic information, is that they're out of their body. Whether they describe it as being their astral body or however they describe it, that's essentially what they're saying is happening. And so I thought, that's interesting, because that's the region of the brain that, in which that happens. It's also the region of the brain that's associated with synesthesia, and a lot of the autistic savants have synesthesia, and synesthesia plays a role in Daniel Tammen's extraordinary memory, where he can recite pi to over 22,000 digits by memory. He says he never had to memorize it; that the numbers just appear to him as different colors and shapes, like a video. And so, that kind of processing is not the kind of processing that you or I do if we're trying to, even recall, pi, even if we had memorized it at one point. So we have to, in our thinking about consciousness, we have to include the fact that there are people who are human beings who actually don't have the same reality portal as us.
It's very, very intriguing what you were saying there, because I was in a debate last November with Jane Aspel, who worked with Olaf Blank over the experiments they did in terms of simulating the out-of-body experience by simulating the idea of seeing yourself outside, well, not seeing yourself outside of yourself, but feeling disembodied. And it was quite intriguing, because the worldview that she was taking was was curious because the person that was in the debate with me was a guy called Graham, and Graham and I have worked together quite a lot in terms of his out-of-the-body experiences, and he has had precognitive out-of-the-body experiences where he precognized a bombing that took place in London in 1999 while he was in an out-of-body state. Now, for me, I am always intrigued by the abilities of individuals in these liminal states, in the kind of hypnagogic states, the hypnopompic states, because it seems that's where, when we're in this kind of REM sleep, when we're in REM intrusion, these kind of things, where we seem to be able to attune into an alternate reality that seems to present itself. It seems to leak into this reality from elsewhere.
That's right.
So an awful lot of what you're saying there, I'm madly nodding along going that this is exactly it. Now, what is your opinion on the work of people like Wilder Penfield, and the simulation, and subsequently then the work of Michael Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry, and the individuals have actually worked with split brain individuals, the way in which the brain can be stimulated in certain ways to evoke memories that have been long lost. This suggests, doesn't it, that the brain has alternate ways of bringing out information. And I wonder whether people like Daniel Trammett and other savants, because I was surprised to discover comparatively recent that Daniel Trammett has actually has temporal lobe epilepsy, which from my point of view is intriguing, fascinating, and quite expected. What's your opinion on these particular areas now? You were initially interested in them, and you've moved along now. So where have you moved on to from there? Because your work now is taking on very, very interesting routes.
You mean where have I shifted my focus? Where am I now since writing my first book? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, effectively. After writing your first book. Actually, I'm quite intrigued as to what stimulated you to write that first book, because there was quite an interesting sudden decision as to write a book on ESP, really. Again, your academic peers must have thought, what on earth is she doing? Or were they kind of positive? Sorry, I'm stringing a lot of questions along because I'm keen to know.
No, of course. No, these are the questions people ask. I mean, it's natural. So first of all, I had spent, by the time that I wrote that book, I wrote that book in 2008, and I started studying neuroscience, in the early 70s, So by the time I wrote that book, I had spent, 3 decades of my life devoted to trying to understand something. And when I discovered, that there was all this evidence, that there really was pre-existing evidence for things that I was told as a psychiatrist were just, absolutely crazy, that people who believe in those things are psychotic, or they're on drugs or whatever, but basically they weren't being, that there really was evidence for these things. Then I thought, well, I'm just was on my own, trying to see if there were neurocorrelates. And once I discovered it, I thought, I need to publish this. As I was raised as a scientist. My passion in life has never been about, making money. It's been about understanding, and trying to, really approximate the truth to the best that I can, and then transmitting it to other people. I came from a long line of academicians, and in fact, I'm going back into academics. And so, because now I actually see that there is an opening, for this kind of work to actually be explored in a way that really didn't exist. I really think that this next year is going to be a real game changer. And so I realized that when I realized why the evidence that still exists was not acceptable enough, I said, okay, well, I know that, and actually I did have, a little bit of flack, from some peers, but anyone who knows me, these weren't people who knew me. See, anyone who knows me knows that I'm just a really solid person, and so they may not understand what I'm working on, but they really have respect for who I am. And so I thought, I thought about it, and I thought, well, who would be the ones who could prove this to the degree that these skeptics really need to see? And I thought about it, and autistic savants came up to me, and I just said, and I put it out there. I basically started talking about that publicly, and then I got contacted by people who have children who have these abilities, and then I discovered that they are all over the place. I just got a letter yesterday from someone who's a retired professor of microbiology about his daughter, whose friend has a child here in the U.S. who's telepathic, and her pediatrician is convinced of it. And so these, they're popping up all over the place. I mean, it's coming to, there's going to be a tipping point here.
In your work, you say that savants, and particularly a particular form of autistic individual, make you believe that they're probably likely to be more telepathic than others. What's your rationale as that? Because I really liked the way in which you decided that particular type of savants would be particularly prone, for want of a better term, to telepathy. Could you explain a little bit about your choice of that and your logic behind that?
Sure. Well, first of all, so the savant syndrome is this ability to do things to an extraordinary degree that that would be extraordinary even if the person didn't have any kind of disability. And with people with autism, who are autistic savants, their disability is oftentimes in the very rudimentary things that we would expect that you needed to have as building blocks in order to have the skill that they exhibit to the extraordinary so for example, someone who can solve complex mathematical equations but doesn't know how to do simple math or do calendar calculations, one of the most common ones. But what's the most interesting are these, like, for example, Oliver Sacks wrote about these two twins back in the 60s who were able to give each other prime numbers back and forth in the 6 digits. And he actually went and looked up a prime table and came back one day and gave them an 8-digit prime, and they were able to, just within like 60 seconds or so, they were able to start tossing 8-digit primes back and forth. And so then he came back and did 10-digit primes and then 12-digit primes. They actually generated 20-digit primes, but they didn't have computers at the time who could actually calculate that far. And so they actually exceeded the computational capacity in the 60s. So how are they doing that? They said that the numbers just appeared to them. They weren't capable of doing simple math. That to me is so similar. It's just to psychic abilities. It's just that their focus, what is their fascination? Their fascination, whatever their obsession is, that seems to be what they seem to know so much about. And some of these things, there isn't really an algorithm for primes numbers, not for all of the primes, So what are they doing? It's like they're quantum processors or something. They're beyond. So I thought, let's look there. And if you do look at the brains of people with autism, it's like, why is it that the savant syndrome is present in them? It's in about 10% of people with autism. That's a really high rate. It's extremely rare in any other conditions. And it also can be acquired by brain damage, and so it's like, what's going on there? And what's fascinating is that if you look at the brains of people with autism, they have the mini columns are the basic functional unit of the cerebral cortex. And if you look at the brains of people with autism, their mini columns are smaller, they're narrower, so their circuitry is, it's actually more efficient than circuitry of mini columns that are larger and in which, it takes more time, for the whole circuit to do its thing. And then on top of that, they actually have more of them. So they've got more of these units. And to a certain extent, some of the units, particularly in the sensory cortex, can be recruited by one area to the other. And so you have these people who are like blind, and they use their visual cortex, which is the most complex of the cortical areas. They actually are using their visual cortex for music or whatever, their savant skill is. And so if you think about these as microprocessors, they've got more of them. And whether you think that the answer is in neurocircuitry or you think the answer is in the tens of millions of microtubules that exist inside the neurons, they've got more of them.
Right, that's intriguing, because funnily enough, as soon as I was just looking through my notes, and one of the questions I was going to be asking was about mini-columns, because I'm fascinated by the implications on the mini-column theory and the idea as well of neuroplasticity and the way in which neuroplasticity seems to have a role somewhere in terms of the way in which autistic individuals are very good at imitation. And I know, because I've been working for an autistic stroke epilepsy charity for the last 18 months, and one of the things we notice in the children there is their ability to imitate and copy in many ways, which effectively is the complete opposite of what the received wisdom is about autism, that autistic individuals don't pick up social cues, are not available to see human beings, external human beings to them, as actually being individuals. They see them as extensions of themselves. But this is then an interesting idea, because if an autistic person sees somebody else as an extension of themselves, it is not at all surprising that they can actually feel their thoughts or feel their ideas. And indeed, with your subjects that you then moved on to, this is what you found, isn't it? That there is this huge empathy and an ability to empathy. So I'm very keen now to move on to the work you've been doing over the last few years with one or two very, very amazing individuals. Individuals that, I suppose, for want of a better term, are almost locked in the sense that they have to communicate in different ways because they can't communicate normally. So I was talking to Dear about this earlier on. This is the nugget, what you're now doing. So I'm really keen for you now to get into the work you're now doing. So feel as long as you need and as long as you want to just explain to the audience exactly what you're now doing. And believe me, guys, this is going to blow your mind. It's going to so much blow your mind. The stage is yours, Diane.
Okay, well, thank you. So one of the children I've been studying is a girl who was 10 years old when I first found out about her, and she is severely autistic, and she's nonverbal. And one of my hypotheses was that if there's any first of all, if there's any interruption that language acquisition has in a skill such as telepathy, because there's some suggestion, with the right hemisphere, with them being more right hemisphere oriented as opposed to left hemisphere oriented. That was another reason why I chose autistic children, is that a lot of if you look at their skills, they tend to be more right hemisphere based skills, and so that's a reversal of the usual left-right hemisphere. We're locked into our left hemisphere often, and we try to do things analytically, whereas that's not how they're deriving answers at all. And so with this girl, she's nonverbal, and I was thinking that would create a strong motivation if anyone's really close with her, like her mother or a caregiver, other than the mother, for a telepathic bond to be the case. And this girl has developed a telepathic bond with at least two of the therapists who work with her in her home on a regular basis. And one of them discovered it because she was doing, they thought she was a mathematical savant, and she was doing complex equations, and what happened was the calculator that the therapist was using stopped working. She had to switch over to another one, and that one gave the answer to this thing in logarithmic notation, and then Haley, the girl, typed out the answer in logarithmic notation, and the therapist said, "How did you know that? It's as though you're reading my mind." And Haley, well, first of all, Haley said, "I see the numbers, the numbers in your head." And she goes, "Are you reading my mind?" And she asked her some other questions, and she knew the answers to those as well. And so she told the family, and they were really surprised, and they thought, well, we don't want people to think our daughter's a freak, and so they didn't really they didn't really do much about it. And then they let a couple teachers know because they didn't want her to be skating by in her homework by having the answers telepathically rather than actually doing her homework, because she goes into school, part of the time, and then she's back home. So what happened was another therapist was working with her, and that she saw that Haley was repeating her mistakes. And so this gave me the opportunity to test her with two different therapists. And when she was initially doing this work with the therapist, there was no barrier, no physical barrier between the two of them, and I knew that I would have to introduce a barrier between the two of them. And so I did, and I did controlled experiments there. And it was really remarkable that she was able to, given that there are all these cameras and distracting things, it was really remarkable that she was able to perform as well as she did. That the most impressive period was when I had her do what was essentially 162 digits, and she did them with only 7 mistakes, and she corrected those mistakes on the second time. So that's just beats the statistical odds. But the problem is that she's not there isn't as a deal of a barrier between hers and the therapist as we would like. And so I want to go back and repeat the experiments with a more ideal setup. As time goes by, then she's more acclimated to there being this barrier between her and the therapist. For anyone who's worked with autistic children, you know that any introduction of any change to them can be really traumatic and cause them to regress. And so she went from independently typing to pointing on a letter board, and that requires more assistance from the therapist than we really want. So, but we analyzed the data to see if there was any evidence of subtle cueing, and she is so direct in the way that she goes to point to the letters, and so quick like this, and if you analyze the letter board and you think about what kind of movements would have to occur to be cueing her, or what kind of hesitation she would have to show to allow the cue to even happen, there's not enough time for that. I mean, she did all of those 162 numbers in 10 minutes, and that's including time that really the therapist is using up, by what she was doing. So anyway, it's really remarkable, and I want to go back and film her. And then in the meantime, I found out about this little boy who's 5 years old. Now, he is, in contrast, he's not nonverbal. He's actually, sorry about that. You want me to wait? Because you're going to be editing this, right? So, okay. Anyway.
Just go with it. Go with it. That's fine.
Yeah. So, sorry. Anyway, he's what's called hyperlexic, and that's when these children have this extraordinary ability to read at an advanced level at a very young age. I mean, he started reading when he was 4 months old, and by the age
hold on, he was 4 months old. He was 4 months old when he started to read.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
The first language was Spanish, and then English and Japanese, and he comes from, his parents are from South America, so so Spanish is their native language. And they both know some English, and they were living in Japan at the time. So that didn't really, the fact that he was reading, in those languages, they picked it up. And then what happened was, it was really surprising, was that when he was about 14 months old, he started writing Arabic, Hebrew, and Hindi, and Russian letters, and was actually able to read in those languages. And the mother had never, he hadn't been exposed to them as far as she knew. And he's 5 years old now, and he's been able to do algebra since he was 4. There's 8 languages that he can read. but he cannot hold a conversation with you. He doesn't engage in that. He's like, he fits the prototypical little professor. You know, the way he is it's more like he'll like to demonstrate something to you and talk about the periodic table or something like that, but he doesn't really have a conversation with you. And so, and I've seen his behavior, and out in public, and so he clearly is autistic, and clearly is a savant. And the reason why his mother contacted me is that he's also telepathic. And I've seen him do, and what's wonderful about being able to do experiments with him is that he can verbalize, he can shout out 81, 29, 32. And I've seen him do it on several occasions, but but he's so hyperactive at this age that it's getting him to settle down and do, you know, a full experiment with me. It has not been possible to date, but I really see that it's possible within the next year, and I'm very excited about it.
When I read your work on this child, I couldn't really get my head around it because the implications are astounding. Effectively,
Yes.
One can argue that arithmetic skills, once you know the structures of an arithmetic skill, you can then expand upon that and can show that in different ways. Whereas learning foreign languages and linguistic skills are completely different. They are non-iterative. You have to understand the language, you have to understand the grammatical structures. And particularly in terms of languages that are written in alternate alphabets other than Latin alphabets, effectively you have to understand the way the words work. And clearly here is a child that has not been taught grammatical structure, but seems to be able to pick up from the ether an ability to speak and read languages that most of us can't do. And I find that absolutely astounding. And effectively, you know, if people could witness what he could do, there is no explanation within the present scientific paradigm. I know of no explanation. One cannot explain that as savant syndrome because it's not savant syndrome. It's something greater again. So in terms of you and your background, what do you think is happening with him? Have you any idea what the source of this may be?
Yes, well, I mean, he really exhibits, you know, what my theory is. I'm not at liberty right now to go into that in any depth right now, but it's one of the things that's fascinating about him is that he has these combination of skills that really usually savants are not quite, you know, they're either mathematical or they're or they're musical, but he seems to be a savant in many ways, and it's fascinating to me. I really want to study him further. I mean, I really see him as being kind of like a Rosetta Stone to understanding consciousness, but he's so young that I can't get him to express his inner experience yet. And a lot of these children, when you look at what's going on in their brain, a lot of them have difficulty recognizing people's faces. There's a condition that also is, you know, in the area of, you know, the angular gyrus, you know, around that area of the brain. And so it's as though they took that area that is our face recognition, and they've recruited it to use for the other skills, you know. And so I don't know that he you know, I mean, he knows that I'm Dr. Powell, but he also always has, like, you know, some prep work for that. And so I don't know what all his deficits are, because he's so, that they're so obsessed that when they're doing things. So I want to image him, but also as I observe him, I'm observing him as someone who has the skills of a behavioral neurologist. And I want to spend as much time with him as possible. I'm applying for grants so that I can spend time with him and observe him and see, and test hypotheses that I have to explain it. Because it's, once you establish, what I want to do is establish a baseline with him he's extremely accurate. And one of the problems is that if he makes a mistake, he's such a perfectionist that then he wants to stop playing. Let's stop playing the telepathy. And what I want to do is have him have more confidence in it and spend more time with him so that we can actually do that, so that I establish 100% accuracy. And then you start playing with variables so that you see, does this have, is there a field effect? Is there a difference between, if we do this, 6 inches away, or we're doing this, 5 miles away. Once you've established a really accurate baseline that you can do comparisons again, you can start asking all kinds of interesting questions. Does his getting feedback enhance the skill because of you're actually getting, information from the future as well as a reinforcement? I mean, it's one of the reasons why people who do remote viewing research are so careful to not give feedback, because of that. They don't want that kind of interference. They want to be able to say, that's purely the remote viewing skill.
I think, again, going back to the language skills, there was people like Saussure, and there were various other people who worked on the idea that there are language universals, and there's universal structures that we can all understand and we can all appreciate. And I can accept that, and I could argue that, okay, in some way, this child is able to access those kind of language programs within the brain, because of course we all learn one language and speak it fluently, so therefore we do have this ability to do so. However, that does not explain his ability to actually read the script, because the script is a human creation, and a script is just a phonetic interpretation of an interpretation of a sound, or pictograms and everything else. That it's a way of showing sounds or a way of showing ideas, which you would not know innately. You could not get to that in this way.
Exactly. So what I'm saying, so what it is they are just like when savants access 20-digit primes. I mean, they're accessing information. Information exists out there, in the field around us. There is information. And so it's fascinating the way in which, there's some people who take, ayahuasca, in order to, with the DMT, in order to shamans access information from the plants around them as to what the healing powers are. I mean, what is that? But that ability to access information is there. And so some people have actually, suggested that autistic children are like people on ayahuasca or DMT, and one of the reasons for that is, looking at some of their, the paintings of Nadia, were compared to the paintings found in the caves. And a lot of people think that the cave paintings were done in mystical states, these sort of, like shamanic states. And so that's an interesting and intriguing idea, and once again, that's, what happens when people take a lot of those drugs is what they do is they stimulate the area of the brain that's around the limbic system. I mean, preferentially, that those deeper structures become actually more active, than is usually the case.
Yeah, because you're probably not aware of this, but last weekend I was on a 3-day event at the University of Greenwich in London called Breaking Convention, and I spoke at the Breaking Convention on some of my hypotheses. And this was a 3-day conference on ayahuasca, dimethyltryptamine, entheogens generally. And one of the areas that I'm trying to join the dots is exactly this, because I'm suggesting that the brain patterns that are stimulated by DMT and the arguments that DMT is endogenous, in the sense that there's arguments to say it could be generated by the pineal gland in some way, as Rick Strassman has suggested. Now, I'm of the opinion that what is happening with people who have Geschwin syndrome, individuals who have autism of different levels, are actually, the DMT is more effective and more immediate in their brain. So therefore it allows them access to what David Bohm would call information. You know, the information field that underlies everything, what Irvin Laszlo would call the Akashic field. And the idea is that the brain accesses this under certain circumstances. And I think it is extremely intriguing, because I've been fascinated by the work of my next guest, who is Daryl Trefford. And I know that Daryl and you are in contact, and in fact Daryl facilitated some of the communications you've had, and his work he did with Kim Peake. Now, one of the things I found about Kim Peake which intrigues me, and I'm desperate to ask you this question as to what your thoughts are on this, but I have discovered that one of the things that Kim Peake had an issue with was, after his birth, they discovered that he didn't have a corpus callosum. So effectively, there's no communication between Kim Peake, between his left and right hemispheres. So in point of fact, his non-dominant hemisphere, his right hemisphere, would have developed independent of his dominant hemisphere. And then you find somebody like Temple Grandin, who has the opposite. She has a very peculiar corpus callosum. And it's something you touched upon earlier on, this idea of the right-left brain, and the idea that in some way the non-dominant hemisphere seems to have, and we're not going into this new age thing about the right and left brain, and we all know that a lot of that is silly, but effectively there is strong evidence from split brain operations that people like Michael Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry have actually shown that individuals do, under these circumstances, effectively become two personalities. And there's the personality that's being dominated. And I just wonder whether the non-dominant personality is the one that is dominant in savants, and this is the reason why. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, you're asking me if the non-dominant, I mean, are you wondering whether or not this is kind of like the cartoon of the devil on one side and the angel on the other side, kind of internal psychological conflicts? Are you wondering if it's related to that?
Not necessarily. I'm more wondering whether the non-dominant hemisphere has an ability to attune into the Akashic field, whatever we want to call it, or into this informational field that is more immediate. You know, effectively, as we said earlier on, savants the information just seems to download. It just seems to be there. It seems to be in front of them. It affects them synesthetically, in the sense that they see things in different ways. And I think Daniel Tremett has said, when he does mathematical structures, each number has a different shape. So therefore, when he puts all the numbers together, he has a different shape, and he knows what that shape is, and that shape is a number. And I'm just wondering if it's just the different way the brain works. And I'm just wondering what your opinions are on that. Is that neurologically a valid point of view, or is it something, me being a layman, I'm putting too many dots together?
Well, let me tell you that this is, let me say this. This is what I have recently come to conclude about the corpus callosum that I find fascinating, and that is that what seems to be the case is that the people who are the most capable of accessing information are people who either don't have a corpus callosum, or those who have one that is even more, has even more fibers going and more connection between the two. It's kind of like, it's like being in a good marriage versus a bad marriage. It's sort of like, it's the bad, if there's conflict, if there's competition between the two hemispheres, if they're not really fully cooperating, then it's not an efficient system. But if you let them each independently do their thing, it's actually a more efficient system, and you can actually, have a positive result. Whereas if if they're really cooperating together, that's even the best of all. And so it's really this. I think it's this. It's not having the right amount of cooperation between the hemispheres that. And if you think about it, like these meditating monks, that have these amazing gamma waves, what is that about? That's about being able to synchronize your brain, to have yourself, that is extreme command over cooperation, within your brain. And so there seems to be this, there seems to be this connection between the two. And what happens is that the cortex in those meditators is actually quieter during, so it's like the cortex, there's a lot of noise in the cortex, and you get away from the noise, and you actually have more access to information. It's like cortical noise. Get the static out of the way. That makes sense.
Does this relate in many ways to, I can't remember who came up with the theory of is it the busy mind theory with autistic individuals, in the sense that they're getting too much information in and it's almost overpowering, so they have to recede away from the information,
yes.
That their brains are open to everything, yes. Really?
Yes. I mean, there's been so much misconception about autism, and that's one of the reasons why I'm doing the work that I do as well. I mean, and very passionate about is that these children, are oftentimes viewed as aloof, and actually they're oftentimes extremely empathic, and they really care. They're oftentimes viewed as not being very intelligent because they can't get their body to cooperate with what they want it to do, and so they're kind of stuck in these bodies, and so they get judged as not being intelligent when oftentimes they're in the genius category, and they've understood everything that's been going on, and they're thought that they're not, and so there's just so many ways in which they're misjudged, but I'm sorry, I don't think I got to your question, but I wanted to say that about autism. It's really important.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, there's some of the person I'm actually reading. There are two people I'm actually fascinated by at the moment. There's an Australian writer called Donna Williams, who is is a highly functioning autistic individual, and some of the things that she describes are uncanny. I mean, one of them, she describes that she visited New York. And when she visited New York, she'd never been to New York before. She brought along a load of paintings with her. And she was staying in an apartment overlooking Central Park. And when she actually entered the room, it was on the 17th floor or something, and she entered the room, looked out of the room, and the actual view from her bedroom window was one of the paintings she had done previously in detail. So effectively she had almost future cognized an event that was yet to happen in her life, and she put it into a painting. Right. Now, that is fascinating. And also, there is a young guy called Tito. And have you come across the work of Tito at all? Again,
yes.
I mean, could you explain
I think that his mother's the person. His mother's the person who developed RPM, I believe, right? You're talking about this boy whose mother developed the letterboard, the technology, rapid prompt methodology that's used for opening up communication with these children who are nonverbal. And
really?
Her son's name is Tito. So it's got to be the same child. Are they Indian?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's actually the methodology that Haley, the first child I mentioned, that's the technology that she was using for the experiments that I did with her. Was that kind of thing. And yeah, and so that created some, people, the skeptics going, oh, well, she's holding the letterboard, or, and it's so hard for people to fathom. It just is so hard for them to fathom. But getting back to your point about, yes, I do agree with the intense world, that theory about autism, that these children are on sensory overload a lot of the time. I mean, a lot of them have extraordinary senses where they can hear things, from far away, and they're very attuned into other people's emotions, and it's so they're retreating from the world because they can't take it, it's and they're just trying to hang on to they're just trying to hang on when they're engaging in these repetitive behaviors, which are soothing for them.
Right, fascinating. Now, I'm
All the
noticing that
evidence points that way.
Right. Okay. Now, I'm aware of the fact that we've got about about 5 or 6 minutes, something like that. What I'd like you to now do is tell us a little bit about your plans for the future. Where are you going with all this, and what are you going to be doing? Because I know that you've got some various exciting projects that you're trying to get off the ground. So if you could let the listeners know what you're planning to do now, because your work is genuinely, it is so important, and any assistance that can be given is just important. So can you let the guys know what you're planning to do, what your future plans are?
Well, I want to go back and test both children again, and really get definitive proof of their abilities, because I've seen it. I just need to, as I say, capture it. And then I'm very excited about my next book. I'm in the midst of writing my basically people call it my magnum opus, because it's really the cumulative knowledge that I've put together, and some exciting new findings that I've made just in the last 6 months, in which what I'm doing is I'm really creating a totally scientifically evidence-based model for understanding consciousness. And there's so much information there that is not being discussed, because the people who are studying consciousness have become so specialized that even when they have interdisciplinary conferences, like the Towards the Science of Consciousness conference that I recently spoke at, if you go to the talks on physics, the speakers have so little time that if you don't know, what, Stuart Hameroff's theory is already, that's too bad, because they don't have time to explain it to you. And so what you have is you have a very small group of people that are studying these things, and for them to understand that level of physics, and also understand the current state of neuroscience, and also understand cellular biology, and also understand molecular biology, to be abreast of all of those things, and then also have the understanding of all of the different experiences of consciousness that I, as a neuropsychiatrist, am aware of, because I've actually sat across from people having those experiences and have interviewed them and gotten a sense of what their world's like. And I know what all these different syndromes are that some people only know of through reading about Oliver Sacks, but that's just a handful of the ones that are out there. And putting that all together, that's what my next book's going to be about. And that theory that has testable hypotheses, and instead of it just being a philosophical debate where we just go round and around and around, about things, and also where it's clear that each one of these levels, from the cellular level all the way up to the psychological level, I want to talk about consciousness at each level, and so I'm very excited about this next book. It'll answer a lot of the questions that you
exactly. Well, this is what I think is so important about your work, because the eliminative materialists have had their day, and effectively it is very frustrating when you read people like Daniel Dennett and the Churchlands and various other individuals who are in this phenomenal denial that there is no internal life, that effectively we are fooling ourselves into thinking we're conscious, we're fooling ourselves into thinking anything, and the Cartesian theatre is total nonsense and everything else. But we all know that there's an inner life going on. We all know, because we all experience it. So therefore, however much the limited materialists shout and scream about, I mean, I've no idea who Daniel Dennett thinks spends his money that he earns from his books, because clearly it's not Daniel Dennett, because Daniel Dennett doesn't exist as far as Daniel Dennett is concerned. But effectively, I think this is a new revolution in thinking, and I think very much you're at the forefront of that. And because there are enthusiastic laymen like myself, but we really need figureheads like yourself who can really talk the talk and walk the walk, and have the academic credibility to really say, look, guys, the viewpoint we have is redundant. We have to start thinking now that there is something magical about the mind. There is something incredible going on behind your ears that is the most complex thing in the universe, you know, and the idea of the discoveries of structures within the microtubule, some of the latest work that I know Stuart Hammerhoff has been publishing. We clearly are moving away now from the major criticism of the brain is too hot and wet, you know, for microtubules to function and for OR to function. Clearly that is now dead in the water, metaphorically and literally, I suppose. So we were in some very, very exciting times, and all I would like to say is that, you know, any support that I can give in my limited way to help your work, I'm more than happy to be involved in any way I possibly can. And in fact, you know, in terms of my contacts and my readers, you know, they really need to log into your work. I've just placed on my Facebook site a link to the video you had of Haley as well, and I'm saying to my readers and my listeners, check this out. It's profoundly important. Okay, we're coming towards the end now.
Thank you. And the other thing is that I'm working on, a documentary. You know, there will be a documentary about all of this research. So
are you trying to crowdsource that in terms of trying to get the capital to move it?
Well, so I did try that, and so, but I don't have sufficient money to do what I, want to do, which is, to go and spend significant time with these children, and particularly the little boy. And so I'm still actually, soliciting funds. Deepak Chopra's foundation will take money on my behalf if people want to donate to a nonprofit. My website has a way in which people can donate to the project, and anyone who donates about a certain amount gets, there are various things people are going to get, like a DVD of the movie, or tickets to the premiere, or autographed book. There's various perks for it. So what I did was I took the crowdfunding and just continued to put it on my website, and so that to help fund my research. And then I also that I applied for a position at Cambridge and the University of Arizona. So I'm hoping to put myself in a position to have graduate students in the future, because a lot of people want to know when they hear about my work. They're like, well, how can I study with you? And I think that that's part of my larger mission too, is to help train a cadre of scientists who are approaching things and in a very systematic way to get answers.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Diane. It's been really, really fascinating. It was exactly as I expected it to be, and it's been wonderful. And I feel we've just scratched the surface. Good. And for everybody else, our next guest, it spins off really nicely, because our next guest will be Daryl Treffert, who both Diane and I know, and he was the advisor for the movie Rain Man. He spent a good deal of his career working with my almost analog name, Kim Peake, and I'm really looking forward to talking to Daryl, because he's somebody I have admired for many, many years as well, rather similar to Diane. So anyway, thanks everybody again for joining us for this chat. Again, as usual, thank you also to the magical Dia Nunez, who sits there in the background in Denver, making things happen to us. And without Dia, this would not happen. So my thanks to her as well. Until next time, thank you again, and thank you, Diane, up there in beautiful Oregon. She has a lovely home there, believe me. If we'd had the opportunity, she would have swung the camera around and showed you the seascape from there. This is really, really nice. Beautiful art and crafts house there. Very, very jealous. But anyway, thanks to everybody, and we'll be back again next month. So thank you very much. Thanks. Bye-bye. And thanks, Diane.
Bye.